The rule in cattle country was simple, and no rancher west of the Powder River ever thought to question it. You did not take in strangers during calving season, and you never, under any circumstance, let anyone near a weak herd who hadn't proven themselves first. Mara Doyle broke that rule on the worst night of March in 1886, soaked to the bone, asking only for a corner of a stranger's barn. And by the time the frost cracked open that spring, she had done what no cattleman in 3 counties believed possible. What she carried in her coat that night, folded into a water-stained notebook, would save 400 head of cattle from a death that had already begun to spread through the valley like a fever nobody could name. Hollis Vance had built his ranch out of stubbornness and good luck in roughly equal measure. 11 years on the same stretch of Wyoming grassland had taught him that a man survived by trusting his own hands and doubting everybody else's. So when a woman appeared at his gate that evening, hair plastered flat with rain, leading a limping horse and nothing else, his first instinct was to send her on to town. Barns for animals, he told her, standing in the doorway with a lantern that barely held against the wind. Town's for miles on. You'll make it before full dark if you hurry. My horse won't, Mara said, and neither will I. He looked at her a long moment. The split boots, the coat gone thin at the elbows, the calm, unhurried way she held herself despite the storm. Something in her didn't beg the way a stranger ought to beg. That should have told him something. It didn't, not yet. One night, he said finally, "Barn, not the house. And you're gone by first light." She nodded and said nothing more, which surprised him almost as much as her being there at all. What Hollis didn't know, what nobody in the valley knew, was that 6 weeks earlier, Mara had buried her father in a rented plot outside Cheyenne, the last of a long line of sheep men who'd worked the hill country of Northumberland before the family crossed the ocean. He'd spent 40 years learning what cold did to animals and what animals did to survive it. And in his last winter, half-blind and coughing blood into a handkerchief, he'd spent his final strength writing it all down. The notebook was leather-bound, swollen with damp, its pages crowded with his cramped hand, lambing calendars, windbreak diagrams, temperature notes scratched in the margins of 100 bad winters. Mara had read it so many times the spine had split. She hadn't come to Vance's ranch by accident. She'd heard in town, 3 days prior, that a strange sickness was moving through the herds south of the river. Animals going down with fever, refusing feed, dying within days despite doctoring. She'd heard, too, that Vance had the largest herd left untouched, and that he didn't believe in omens. She needed shelter. She also needed, though she hadn't said it aloud yet, somewhere to test what her father's notebook actually knew. That first night, she slept in the hay loft above 30 head of weanling calves, her father's book tucked against her chest like a second heartbeat. By morning she hadn't left. "Thought I said first light," Vance said, finding her already down among the stock, running a hand along a calf's ribs. "This one's breathing wrong," she said, not looking up. 26 breaths a minute, when it ought to be under 20. "And her coat's tacky, not dry. That's not weather. That's the start of something." Vance crossed his arms. "That's a calf that got rained on same as the rest of us." "Maybe," Mara said. "Give me 3 more days. I'll work for my keep, ask nothing else. If I'm wrong, I'll be gone before you have to say it twice." He should have refused. Every rancher he respected would have refused. But something about the exactness of her, the specific number of breaths, the specific feel of the coat, needled at him in a way vague talk never could have. 3 days, he said. "Mucking stalls. That's all." She didn't smile, only nodded once, the way she'd nod at every hard bargain that spring. That night, by lamplight in the loft, she opened the notebook to a page marked with a strip of tartan cloth, worn thin from handling. Her father's hand, angled and firm despite the shake that had come into it near the end, read, "A sick beast tells you before it falls. Watch the breath, watch the coat, watch how she stands. By the time she's down, you've already lost the fight. The fight's won or lost while she's still on her feet." Mara had heard him say those words aloud 100 times as a girl, standing beside him in a Northumberland gale while he pressed his palm flat against a ewe's flank. Watch the breath. Watch the coat. Watch how she stands. The notebook held more than warnings. It held method. Pages on what her father called banking, a technique he'd learned from an old shepherd near Kielder who'd learned it from his own father before him. In brutal cold, Newborn stock couldn't be left to the open pasture or even a drafty barn. They needed graduated shelter, an outer windbreak of woven brush and stacked sod to break the worst of the wind, an inner ring of deep straw bedding banked at least 14 inches high to hold ground heat, and, at the center, a low-roofed warming pen no more than 6 feet across, small enough that a calf's own body heat could raise the air inside by several degrees within the hour. He'd sketched the layout dozens of times, refining the angles, noting which orientations best broke a north wind versus a west one. Beside one diagram, he'd written, "A weak calf doesn't need warmth thrown at it. It needs warmth kept in." There was more. Notes on separating any animal showing early fever from the rest of the herd, on scalding water pails so troughs didn't freeze solid, on watching the color of a calf's gums for the gray that came before real trouble. It wasn't magic. It was patient, exact, unglamorous work. But it was also, Mara believed, the only thing standing between Hollis Vance's herd and whatever was already killing cattle to the south. She began small, one-banked shelter, built in a low corner of the near pasture where the fence broke the wind on 2 sides. She worked through her 3 days, and then simply kept working, and Vance, distracted by 400 head and a foreman down with a broken wrist, didn't stop her. The first attempt failed within 36 hours. She'd set the windbreak wall at 4 feet, too low to fully block the gusts that came screaming down off the ridge, and she'd banked the straw only 8 inches deep instead of the 14 her father's notes called for. A calf she'd moved into the shelter overnight was found shivering and down by morning, its breathing shallow, its gums pale. 14 head lost to that sickness south of here just this week, Vance said, standing over the shivering calf with his hat pushed back, not bothering to hide the edge in his voice. "And you want me to believe stacking straw higher does what a doctor with medicine can't?" "I set it too low," Mara said, crouched beside the calf, checking its breathing. "The wall's not tall enough, and the bedding's too thin. That's my mistake, not the methods." "Convenient," Vance said, "that it's never the method." She didn't argue. She pressed her palm flat into the straw the way her father used to, feeling for warmth rising from the ground, and found almost none. Too thin, too loosely packed, letting the ground's cold bleed straight up through it. She rebuilt that afternoon, raised the windbreak wall to 6 feet using split fence rail and packed sod, doubled the straw depth to just over 14 inches, and this time tamped it firm instead of leaving it loose. An old hand named Ezra Colt, who'd wintered cattle in the territory longer than anyone on the ranch, watched her work and offered the only useful thing anyone said to her that week. "You want that straw packed tight at the bottom, loose on top," he said around a mouthful of tobacco. "Tight holds the ground heat. Loose on top traps the air. My grandmother did the same with her chicken coop, only she used feathers." Mara adjusted the pin exactly as he said. That night, she set a stub of candle just inside the warming pen's entrance, sheltered from any draft, and watched it. If the flame guttered, there was a wind gap somewhere in her wall. It burned steady until she fell asleep against a fence post near 2 in the morning, and when she woke at dawn, it was still burning, and the calf inside, a different one, moved there as a test, stood on its own, breathing easy, coat already drying. 20 breaths a minute, she told Vance, holding her father's pocket watch. "Coat's dry. She's fine." He looked at the calf a long moment, said nothing, and walked away. But he didn't tear the pen down, either. By the second week of April, Mara had built 11 of the shelters scattered across the low pasture, each one logged in a small ledger she kept in her coat pocket. Date built, orientation to the wind, number of heads sheltered, condition each morning. Vance's own foreman, still nursing his wrist, watched the operation with open skepticism, and most of the hands avoided the low pasture altogether, preferring to work the main herd the way they always had. Meanwhile, word from the south kept getting worse. A rancher named Whitfield lost 60 head in 8 days. The doctor in town, a tired, decent man named Alden Reyes, rode out twice to look at Vance's stock, and each time found nothing conclusive, only Mara's careful notes and a scattering of animals that seemed, against expectation, to be thriving. It wasn't easy going. Materials ran short. The split rail for windbreak walls had to be hauled from a stand of timber 2 miles off, and after a week of steady work, Mara's hands were raw and cracked from handling frozen rope and greenwood. One evening, hauling a sledge of straw across half-frozen mud, she lost her footing on a slick patch and went down hard, wrenching her ankle badly enough that she couldn't walk without a limp for 3 days. Vance's young stepson, a quiet boy of 11 named Dutch who rarely spoke more than a few words at a time, began appearing at her side without being asked, carrying pails, packing straw, holding the lantern steady while she worked past dark. He said little, but he watched everything she did and copied it exactly, and more than once she found a pen rebuilt and tamped firm that she hadn't gotten to yet. Even the ranch dog, a rangy blue heeler named Scout, who'd spent years indifferent to anything that wasn't cattle work, took to trailing Mara through the pasture, sniffing at each new shelter with unusual interest, and once, 3 nights running, refusing to settle near a pen that Mara later found had a gap in its northern wall wide enough to let wind straight through. "How long?" Dutch asked her one night, the only full sentence she'd heard from him in a week. "Before we know if it worked?" "I don't know," Mara admitted. "Might be we never know for certain unless the worst comes and finds us ready." He nodded slowly, the way a boy nods at an answer he doesn't like but accepts anyway, and went back to packing straw. The setback came on the 17th of April, when a sudden thaw turned the low pasture into standing water almost overnight, flooding 3 of the shelters and forcing Mara to abandon the low ground entirely and rebuild higher on drier rise. A full day's lost labor and nearly 200 pounds of ruined straw. She didn't rush the rebuild despite the pressure of time. She walked the new ground first, checking drainage, checking wind direction with a wetted finger held up against the evening air, refusing to place a single post until she was certain of the angle. It cost her 3 more days than she wanted to spend. But when she finished, the new shelters sat higher, drier, and better oriented than the first attempt had ever been. By the last week of April, the signs had started. Cattle in the main herd began bunching tight against fence corners for no clear reason, refusing open pasture even on mild days. Scout took to pacing the ranch yard at odd hours, ears low, refusing food. One morning, Ezra Colt studied the sky a long while and pointed out a hard ring around the moon the night before, pale and wide. "Old sign," he said. "Means weather's building somewhere it hasn't shown itself yet." Vance dismissed it outright. "A ring round the moon doesn't feed cattle," he said, standing in the yard with his arms crossed, addressing Ezra and Mara both. "We've got real sickness killing real herds south of here, and folks are out here reading rings in the sky like it's gospel." Mara said nothing in return. She spent that evening instead walking every shelter in the low pasture, checking each windbreak wall for gaps, adding a second layer of straw to the pens holding the youngest calves, tightening every rope and stake against wind that hadn't arrived yet. It arrived 2 nights later, and it came fast, not the disease from the south this time, but a true late-season blizzard, dropping temperatures 30 degrees in under 4 hours and driving snow sideways hard enough to strip bark from young cottonwoods. Vance's main herd, penned in open corrals the way it had always been penned, began drifting downwind in a panic, calves separated from mothers in the whiteout, several going down in snowdrifts too deep to climb free of. 2 ranches to the west lost stock outright that night. Animals found frozen against fence lines by morning, huddled uselessly in the open the way cattle always huddled, offering their broad flanks to the merciless wind. In the low pasture, Mara's shelters held, mostly. Deep in the storm, close to midnight, she found the windbreak wall on her largest pen bulging dangerously inward, straining under drift and wind pressure until one of the split rails cracked clean through with a sound like a rifle shot. 6 calves were sheltered inside. Without hesitation, she waded into snow past her knees, Dutch appearing at her side seconds later with a coil of rope neither of them remembered fetching, and together, hands numb, faces raw from the wind, they lashed a spare fence post against the broken rail and repacked snow and straw hard against the gap until the wall held again. Scout stood over the calves the entire time, low growl in his throat, refusing to move even as snow buried his hindquarters. "Hold it! Hold it!" Mara shouted over the wind, bracing the post with her shoulder while Dutch cinched the rope tight, and for nearly 10 minutes neither of them said another word, only worked, cold burning through wet gloves, until the wall stopped shuddering under the wind's weight. It was near 2 in the morning when Hollis Vance himself came stumbling through the drifts, half blind in the whiteout, shouting a name that wasn't Mara's or Dutch's. His hired man Colton had gone out after a lost heifer near the ridge and hadn't returned. And in a storm like this, a man on foot in open country had perhaps an hour before the cold finished what the wind started. They found Colton 40 minutes later, collapsed against a fence line half a mile out, already shaking too hard to stand, his hands gone the color of old wax. There was no time to reach the house. Mara made the decision without discussion, pointing toward the nearest shelter, the very first pen she'd built weeks earlier, rebuilt twice since, banked deep with straw, and shielded on 3 sides by a windbreak wall now proven against exactly this kind of storm. They dragged Colton inside, packed straw around him the same way she packed it around every newborn calf that spring, and within the confined heat of that small space, out of the direct wind for the first time in over an hour, his shaking slowed. Vance knelt beside him, gripping his hand, saying nothing, watching the color creep back into fingers that 20 minutes earlier had looked past saving. 22 breaths a minute, Mara said quietly, timing him against her father's pocket watch, the same count she'd used on 100 calves that spring. He'll hold. Vance looked up at her across the small, straw-packed space, snow still melting from his hat brim, and said nothing at all. But something in his face had changed, something that no argument in April could have moved. Morning came gray and still, the way mornings always came after a storm had spent its worst. Vance rode the full property himself before breakfast, tallying losses the same exacting way Mara tallied her shelters. And the numbers, when they were finally set down side by side that afternoon in her small ledger, told a story plainer than any argument could. Of the 412 head in Vance's main herd, left in open corrals through the storm, 31 had died, and another 14 showed signs of frostbite severe enough to cost hooves or ears. Of the 60-some head sheltered across Mara's 11 pens in the low pasture, not one had died. Not one showed lasting harm. Losses elsewhere in the valley ran far worse. Whitfield's ranch alone lost better than 80 head between the sickness and the storm combined, and by week's end, 3 other outfits reported losses near a third of their herds. Vance didn't say much about it. He wasn't a man built for long speeches, and the storm hadn't changed that. But 2 mornings later, without being asked, he showed up in the low pasture at dawn carrying an armful of split rail and set to work extending the windbreak line himself, matching the angle of her existing walls almost exactly. He asked her, gruffly, how deep she wanted the straw packed on the new section, and when she told him 14 inches, tamped tight at the bottom, he didn't question it. He simply began packing. Word moved through the valley the way word always moves after a bad storm. Slow at first, then all at once. Ezra Colt told it at the feed store, and the shopkeeper, a sharp-eyed woman named Bertha Klein who'd sold Mara rope and nails on credit back in March without asking many questions, began keeping a small stack of sketches by the register showing the shelter's layout, handing them out to any rancher who asked. Dr. Reyes, riding through on his rounds, stopped at the low pasture himself and studied the pens a long while, asking pointed questions about ventilation and straw depth, then rode on to 2 more ranches that same week, saying only that it was worth a look. Whitfield, who'd lost the most of anyone, sent his son over within the month asking, plainly and without embarrassment, if somebody might show him how it was built. Mara never framed it as vindication, and if anyone expected her to, they were disappointed. She simply kept working, kept the ledger, kept the pins tight against the next hard freeze, same as always. Dutch stayed at her side through most of it, and Scout never again slept anywhere but near the low pasture gate. One evening in late May, with the worst of the season finally behind them, Vance found her sitting on an overturned bucket near the shelters, the notebook open on her knee, worn nearly through at the spine now. He stood a while without speaking, looking at the pages crowded with a stranger's careful hand. "Your father teach you all this?" he asked finally. "Most of it," Mara said. "The rest I learned getting it wrong first." Vance nodded slowly, looking out over the low pasture, the shelters standing dark and solid against the evening light, 60 head of cattle grazing easy and unbothered nearby. He didn't apologize, not in so many words. He only picked up a length of split rail lying nearby and set it against the fence line where it belonged, the way he'd done every morning since the storm. A shelter built for the weakest animal in the herd will hold a wall when the strongest one has fallen.